On my birthday, I got into a car accident and was trapped in the car with my husband's first love. My doctor husband rushed to the scene and chose to save the frightened her first. I was stuck in the deformed seat, covered in blood, and pleaded for his help, but received a cold response. She's pregnant. There are 2 lives at stake. Can't you understand the situation? Later, his heroic act of saving her was recorded by a bystander and quickly uploaded online, garnering countless blessings. His friends all treated me as a joke, holding the video to my face with ill intent, taunting, "Margaret, you won't be that petty, right?" Just off the operating table, I clutched the miscarriage notice in my hand and smiled indifferently. No, I won't. After all, this marriage, along with Bruno, is something I don't intend to keep. Let her have it. Chapter 1. The moment the anesthesia wore off, the pain surged like a tidal wave. I lay in the hospital bed, pale and trembling uncontrollably, unable to withstand the searing agony in my chest that felt as if it had been pierced by a sharp weapon. In front of me, a video kept looping on my phone. At the scene of a car accident, a man rescued an injured woman in time. They looked into each other's eyes amidst the fireworks, their passionate gazes blending together. Picturesque and beautiful, the comment section was overwhelmed. A hero saving a beauty brought to life. So sweet! The lingering look in their eyes. Definitely true love. Crying. Handsome man and beautiful woman, they should be locked together with a lock. I'll swallow the key. Everyone praised them as a perfect match. If that hero wasn't my husband, Bruno, and if I wasn't the unconscious one at the scene of the accident, I could have calmly offered my blessings too, self-destructively pulling the progress bar repeatedly. I held back for a long time but still couldn't stop the tears from falling embarrassingly. Today is my birthday. Bruno had promised to celebrate it with me, but Camille just said, "Bruno, my stomach feels a bit uncomfortable," and he turned around to pick her up without a second thought. To rush to the hospital in time, he anxiously stepped on the accelerator, causing an accident halfway. Because of Bruno's timely protection, Camille was only frightened. I, however, crashed into the car door due to his sudden turn and was trapped in the deformed back seat. Unable to move, my lower body suddenly bled profusely, and the sharp pain in my lower abdomen caused me to lose consciousness. When I struggled to call for his help, I received a cold response. "Millie is pregnant. 2 lives. Margaret, can't you be more sensible at a time like this?" Covered in blood, I was thunderstruck. It felt like my head was heavily hammered. Blanking out, through my blurred vision, he ran towards Camille without looking back. I heard him tell her not to panic, that he was there. His tone was gentle, with an imperceptible tremble. He was so afraid Camille might get hurt. Smelling the nauseating gasoline, I completely passed out. Fortunately, I survived, but at a terrible cost. Gently stroking my aching lower abdomen, I smiled self-deprecatingly and turned off the looping video. For a moment, it seemed meaningless, awakened again in the middle of the night by the pain. I couldn't bear it and got up to ask for some painkillers, but I bumped into Bruno in the corridor. Despite it being after work hours, he was still in his white coat, the hem disheveled, and his face weary. I calmly asked him, "Were you with Camille?" Bruno looked at me expressionlessly. "Margaret, I don't have time for your nonsense." He said it so calmly and steadily, without the slightest guilt of lying, but he couldn't hide the strong scent of gardenia all over him. That was Camille's favorite perfume. How intimate must they have been for the scent to cling so stubbornly? Looking at Bruno, I suddenly felt no emotion. "Let's get a divorce. Margaret, what are you making a fuss about this time?" Bruno's face changed. He said impatiently, "Just because I didn't celebrate your birthday?" I didn't answer, but he seemed to assume it, his lips curling into a cold smile. "Millie is having a hard time with the pregnancy now. As a friend, what's wrong with me taking care of her a bit more? You're just petty and overly dramatic. Simply incorrigible." Bruno was about to continue scolding when his phone suddenly rang. His previously stern face softened instantly. No need to guess. It must be Camille. Facing his former first love, Bruno never hesitated to show a bit of tenderness. After hanging up, he hastily threw out a sentence. I've been really busy lately. I'll make up for your birthday another day. Then he turned and left with big strides. Bruno was always like this. Every time he abandoned me for Camille, he would give me a sweet treat afterward to compensate. He couldn't see the pale hospital gown on me. Not a word of concern or worry. Even though I almost died in front of him, there was not a hint of guilt. His mind and eyes were full of Camille. I used to be trapped in a self-deceptive marriage, binding myself in a cocoon. But now, I am truly tired. I raised my hand to wipe away the coldness on my face, and I truly no longer felt sad. Chapter 2. No one would believe it if I said it. It was Bruno who pursued me initially. We met through a blind date, sharing some similar hobbies. Later, after chatting in detail, we discovered that our parents had been friends for many years. So, it was only natural that we stepped into the halls of marriage. I knew he had a first love whom he had been with for 7 years. But we were all adults. I believed he would handle everything well. Yet, I was too naive. Ever since Camille returned to the country pregnant, my life turned upside down. The always calm and self-possessed Bruno completely changed. When I had a high fever, he accompanied Camille to the countryside to watch the stars. On our wedding anniversary, he went to Camille's house to fix the plumbing, leaving me alone in an empty restaurant. If I showed any hint of complaint, it became ugly evidence of jealousy. Although I was his wife, I became a secondary choice. But all the heartache and grievances in the future have nothing to do with me anymore. Before logging out of WeChat, I saw a message from the research director. Once again, she was urging me to go abroad for further study. Actually, she had mentioned this to me as early as 6 months ago. At that time, I had politely declined, because of the long 2 years and because I couldn't bear to leave Bruno. I just wanted to live a simple and stable life with him. But such a small wish, Bruno couldn't fulfill for me. I took a deep breath and called the director directly. Director son, I wanted to ask, is the opportunity for overseas training you mentioned earlier still available? Maggie, have you finally figured it out? Director son on the other end was stunned, then happily exclaimed, of course! I've kept this spot just for you. There's less than a month left. Can you get ready in time? I promptly made an online appointment for a divorce application. Don't worry, everything will be on time. This time, it's enough to get a divorce. Chapter 3. The next afternoon, I packed my things and called a cab to go home. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. I entered the guest room, lifted the covers, and fell into a deep sleep. I was awakened by the sound of knocking. Margaret! It was Bruno's voice. Unusually, it carried a hint of urgent annoyance. Unable to bear the noise, I reluctantly got up to open the door. Outside, Bruno was glaring at me angrily, his gaze full of reproach. Why was he suddenly so angry? I didn't understand. Yawning, I said, sorry, I was too tired and didn't hear you. Why didn't you call me when you were discharged? Bruno asked with deeply furrowed brows. I was quite surprised. There's no need to bother you for something so trivial. A car accident injury is considered trivial? Bruno looked at me with reproachful eyes. Margaret, did you deliberately harm yourself to spite me? How could you do something so reckless? Being scolded for no reason. In the past, I would have definitely argued with Bruno. But now, I just smiled calmly and serenely. You're overthinking. The doctor said I've recovered well and allowed me to be discharged. Thanks for your concern. My attitude was polite but distant. Bruno was stunned. He was about to speak when a woman's coquettish voice came from behind him. Margaret, you're home? Why didn't you tell me? In the middle of the night, Camille appeared in a cool camisole nightdress, looking completely at ease, as if she were the mistress of the house. Instinctively, I glanced at Bruno. He rubbed his nose, unusually uneasy. Millie's house suddenly had a leak, and since she's pregnant, I couldn't leave her alone. Pregnant women do need special care. I understand. Bruno was momentarily stunned. I smiled at him. Margaret, you're not angry? I chuckled. Helping friends is normal, especially since she can't be alone right now. And you're a doctor. It's your expertise. Hearing this, Camille's expression changed slightly, and Bruno looked utterly incredulous. I waited a while, Seeing him still standing there, I turned to go back to sleep, but Bruno suddenly grabbed my hand. No, Margaret. I know you must be angry. Now it was my turn to be stunned. I saw Bruno press his lips together. You didn't react like this before. I couldn't help but recall the past. Whenever Camille called, he would always go to her, never missing a call. We had countless arguments over this. I had cried, raged, and even scratched his face hysterically like a madwoman, but he remained unmoved. He would even scold me back. A person with a dirty heart sees everything as dirty. But now, facing these two again, I felt no emotion at all. I didn't love him anymore. Naturally, I didn't care, so I politely withdrew my hand. It's late. Don't overthink it. Bruno stared at his hand, paused midair. Ah. Bruno. My stomach suddenly hurts. Camille suddenly clutched her abdomen, her eyes red, looking like she might faint any moment. Millie! Bruno shouted, his brows full of anxiety. He unabashedly held her in his arms, turning to glare at me. Margaret, I thought you'd change, but I was wrong. Being petty with a pregnant woman, aren't you afraid of karma? With a loud bang, he left with Camille, slamming the door. Such things had happened many times before, but this time, I felt no waves in my heart. I went downstairs, made myself a late-night snack, ate too much, and couldn't sleep. I lay in bed playing on my phone and accidentally saw Camille's post from 3 minutes ago. At the hospital, she leaned intimately on Bruno's shoulder. Bruno slightly bowed his head, his slender fingers gently stroking her protruding belly. The caption read, "My Bruno will be the best dad in the world." The comment section was buzzing. They were mostly mutual friends of Bruno and Camille. Some even tagged me to provoke me. I looked down at my flat belly, a self-mocking smile on my lips. I lightly tapped the screen and replied, "Congratulations on getting what you wished for." Chapter 4. In the days that followed, Bruno didn't come home. I enjoyed the peace and focused on my recovery. In the meantime, I contacted a lawyer and got a divorce agreement drafted. Before I knew it, it was time for my follow-up appointment at the hospital. I didn't expect to run into Bruno. The moment he saw me, his face turned cold. That post on Millie's WeChat was just a joke. You provoked her, and pregnant women are sensitive. If something happens to her and the baby, can you take responsibility? If something happens to her and the baby. Bruno's words suddenly reminded me. Memories I had tried to forget came rushing back. The car accident, the blood, the unconsciousness, the sympathetic look from the doctor on the operating table, and the form I forced myself to sign for the induced labor. I stood frozen, my heart feeling as if it were being torn apart by giant hands, the pain suffocating. Seeing me remain silent, Bruno assumed I felt guilty and grabbed my hand without further ado. Today, you must apologize to Millie and get her forgiveness. Though I had been resting for several days, the miscarriage caused by the car accident had left me weak and exhausted. Bruno forcibly dragged me into Camille's hospital room. It was crowded with people. As soon as they saw me, their faces showed disdain. These were the same people from the comments section that day. Upon entering the room, Camille casually mentioned she wanted to eat mangoes. Bruno's hands didn't stop moving. He normally didn't like eating fruit, and as a doctor, he was very particular about his hands. I remember once, during my period, I asked him to make me a bowl of brown sugar water, but he coldly refused. Margaret, I'm a doctor. My hands are very precious. Can't you order takeout? But now, he let the sticky juice soak his hands, patiently peeling a whole plate of mangoes for Camille. It was treatment I had never received. The mocking gazes directed at me grew more intense. Witnessing all this, I remained calm. We were getting divorced. It had nothing to do with me. Camille, as if just realizing it, teased Bruno. Come on, Bruno, you're so good to me. Margaret must be dying of jealousy. Bruno stopped what he was doing, glanced at me intentionally, and sneered coldly. Can't you do things yourself without me reminding you? He then tossed a mango from the fruit basket at me. I instinctively caught it and placed it on the side table. Seeing my series of actions, Bruno looked momentarily stunned. I knew what he was surprised about. He had given me an out. and I hadn't gratefully accepted it. Someone rolled their eyes. Oh, she's gotten smarter. Knows how to retreat to advance. What a tactic! Hearing this, Bruno's stern expression inexplicably softened a bit. He continued peeling fruit for Camille, but his gaze kept lingering on me, as if trying to catch a moment of my losing composure. But I remained indifferent, staring out the window. Under the harsh lighting, his face darkened a bit. Seeing this, Camille's eyes glistened with tears as she cautiously said, "Margaret, if you mind, you can have all these mangoes." Her pitiful act made me look like the bad guy. This was Camille's usual petty tactic. She wanted to provoke me on purpose, waiting for Bruno to scold me. But I no longer cared. I smiled calmly, stood up, and was about to leave, but Bruno suddenly stood up and blocked my way. Frowning at me, "Margaret, why aren't you angry? What are you talking about?" I looked at him in confusion. His gaze became a bit frantic. "I'm taking such good care of Millie. Doesn't it bother you?" I replied politely, "You're friends. It's reasonable to care for each other." "No, it's not reasonable." Bruno pressed his lips tightly, his eyes reddening at the corners. "Why are you ignoring me? Not getting jealous? You weren't like this before." Next to us, Camille's expression nearly broke. "Bruno, what are you talking about? Shut up!" Bruno uncharacteristically shouted at Camille. Everyone was stunned. Even I was somewhat dazed. This kind of anxiety and restlessness. It used to be me. The commotion caught the attention of the ward doctor. He looked somewhat familiar. He was the doctor who had urgently treated me back then. Upon entering, he first asked me with concern, "Miss Gu, how have you been? Any more vaginal bleeding?" I hadn't had a chance to speak. Vaginal bleeding. "Margaret, do you have some kind of disease?" "Oh, should I not have asked?" Camille exclaimed in shock. She looked innocent and surprised, but her eyes were filled with malice. It even caught the attention of passers-by outside the door. The gazes directed at me were full of mockery and undisguised humiliation. But the next moment, vaginal bleeding in women, excluding pathological issues, is a normal physiological phenomenon. If you don't understand, just shut up and stop misleading people. The doctor scolded Camille, then turned to look reproachfully at Bruno. "Dr. Lou, your wife just had a miscarriage from a car accident. Her body is weak. How can you lose your temper at her as her husband?" Chapter 5. The ward doctor didn't stay long. After a few admonishments, he left the room. But even after 5 minutes, the room remained deathly silent. Everyone's eyes kept darting between Bruno and me. But no one dared to speak. Finally, Bruno broke the silence first. "You were pregnant and had a miscarriage. Margaret, why didn't you tell me?" "There was no need. I could handle it myself." Facing his expression of shock and anger, I brushed it off lightly. That little life was gone. There was no point in saying more. Seeing my indifferent expression, Bruno suddenly got angry. "Margaret, that was my child too. How can you say it was unnecessary?" His voice was hoarse, his face filled with disbelief, meeting his red-rimmed eyes. I sneered. "Are those crocodile tears?" I hadn't intended to mention the child. Our marriage was beyond saving, and a child wouldn't change that. I didn't want to disturb the child's peace or let them become a topic in a failed relationship. But Bruno, you brought this on yourself. I don't mind cutting you with words, letting you taste the pain I felt. When the car accident happened, you were there. I was lying in a pool of blood, my knees full of glass shards, begging you to save me. Bruno, what were you doing? Seeing Bruno's trembling eyes, I smiled lightly. "Oh, I remember. You saved Camille, who was unscathed and only a little frightened. You made your choice, so why blame me? Besides, taking a step back, Camille is pregnant. As long as you're willing, having more people call you dad wouldn't be a loss, right?" Bruno was speechless, his body trembling, his fists clenched tightly. At that moment, Camille suddenly exclaimed, "Margaret, I didn't expect you to go through something like this. As a mother myself, I know how painful it is to lose a child. You must be very sad about your miscarriage." She gently stroked her protruding belly, a seemingly sympathetic expression hiding a clear smile. As compensation, why don't you become the godmother of my baby? Bruno cares so much about this baby. Whenever I feel uncomfortable, he gets extremely worried. If you treat this child as your own, it might ease your pain of losing yours. I always knew Camille was shameless, but I didn't expect her to be this vile. Her words ignited a long-dormant anger in me. I walked up to her bed, raised my arm high, and slapped her hard. Caught off guard, she stumbled onto the bed, holding her face in disbelief. I used to ignore you because a fly won't land on an egg without cracks. Bruno couldn't control himself. I'm not someone who teaches wives or enjoys dealing with mistresses. Your repeated provocations are childish, but you should never have insulted my child. If it happens again, it won't be solved with just a slap. I smirked, then picked up the plate of mangoes and walked up to Bruno, raising my wrist. I gently tipped the plate, pouring the fruit all over Bruno. In an instant, his clean white coat became a mess. Do you know why I didn't take the mango? I wiped away the mockery in my eyes and looked at Bruno, speaking each word clearly, because I'm allergic to it. I had a reaction in front of you on our first date. If you can't even remember what your wife eats, don't pretend to care. Enjoying the sight of his suddenly pale face, I laughed heartily. Stop being so hypocritical, Dr. Lou. Chapter 6. Before leaving, I casually left the divorce papers behind. Then I went for my follow-up appointment. Bruno, surprisingly stubborn, insisted on accompanying me. I don't accept the divorce. I'm your husband, Margaret. I have that right. I didn't bother arguing with him, prioritizing my health. After the examination, the attending doctor said I was recovering well. Hearing this, Bruno let out a sigh of relief, showing a relieved expression. He then took the initiative to pay the bills and get the medication. I watched coldly. I wasn't going to refuse free labor, even when I was about to call a cab home. He insisted on driving me. Margaret, given your condition, I'm worried. He glanced at me cautiously, as if I were a fragile porcelain doll needing careful handling. Before I could respond, an elderly lady passing by suddenly called out to him, Dr. Lou, it really is you. Dr. Lou. Seeing Bruno's surprised look, she smiled even more warmly. Don't you remember me? I was your patient when your wife was pregnant and hospitalized. I was in the bed next to hers. Oh my, I've never seen a man as wonderful as you, Dr. Lou. Despite your busy schedule, you always found time to be with your wife, serving her tea, massaging her cramping legs. It made me so envious. I hope my daughter finds a husband as caring as you when she gets married. The lady rambled on. Bruno was initially stunned, then looked at me in panic. His face was full of fear and anxiety. I listened calmly, feeling the weight of Bruno's meticulous care for Camille. After chatting for a good 5 minutes, the lady finally noticed me standing there. Oh, is this one of your patients, Dr. Lou? Oh, I'm so sorry for holding you up. I smiled but said nothing, not wanting to be associated with Bruno. We would soon be strangers after the divorce, but for some inexplicable reason, Bruno grabbed my hand, telling the lady earnestly, No, this is my wife. Oh, your wife. Wait, your wife. The lady's face turned from shock to disdain. In no time, her gaze towards Bruno became filled with contempt. She forced a smile, and as she turned to leave, she muttered loud enough for all to hear. Having a wife yet always hanging around a pregnant woman. He looks decent but is worse than a beast. Cheaters like him are everywhere. It's so disgusting. Oh my God. I wished for the wrong thing. My daughter will definitely find a faithful man, not someone like this. Ugh. I couldn't understand Bruno's behavior. Why create trouble for himself? Was he insane? Still, he insisted on driving me home personally. You just had a miscarriage. You need to take good care of your body, or you'll suffer long-term effects. Seeing his serious attitude, I nonchalantly agreed. Whatever. A free driver is a free driver. Bruno told me to wait at the hospital entrance while he fetched the car from the parking lot. Before leaving, he tightly gripped my hand. Wait for me 5 minutes, okay? His usually cold eyes held a hint of pleading. I agreed, But after 10 minutes of waiting, there was still no sign of Bruno or his car. I glanced down, opened the ride-hailing app on my phone. 15 minutes later, I was safely home, as I sipped a warm cup of milk. The door opened again. Bruno appeared at the door, looking disheveled. He tightly pressed his lips together and looked at me, just a little more time. Margaret, why didn't you wait for me? Chapter 7. Why didn't I wait for him? Good question. Flipping through the documents in my hand, I didn't look up, I did wait. You were late and broke your promise, but it was just a little more time. You went to see Camille, didn't you? I cut him off abruptly. Don't bother denying it. There's her lipstick on your collar. The mark was glaringly obvious. A blatant provocation. Camille had set the stage. Not fulfilling her plan would be a shame. Millie suddenly fainted, and I was worried something might happen to her. Bruno's face showed undeniable panic. There's really nothing between us. You misunderstood. His hoarse voice carried a hint of barely perceptible grievance. As if I had caused him great sorrow, but I was the one truly suffering. I laughed bitterly, feeling an indescribable rage. You feel wronged over such a small thing? But Bruno, the pain I've endured because of you goes far beyond this. When we got married, you tearfully promised to make me happy for a lifetime, without shedding a tear. But in reality, all the suffering and humiliation I've endured were brought by you. 2 months ago, during a heavy rain, you volunteered to pick me up. But halfway there, Camille called, and you left me on the roadside. I walked in the rain for 2 hours, got a bacterial infection, and ended up in the hospital. A month ago, during a business trip, I encountered a local riot. I was so scared. I took the earliest flight, 14 hours to get to you, seeking peace, only to find you hugging Camille, singing her a birthday song. A week ago, I was bleeding profusely, begging you to save me and our baby. I was so desperate. And what did I get in return? You took Camille and got on the ambulance without looking back. Not even a word of concern. If it weren't for the firefighters arriving in time, I would have died in that gasoline-soaked inferno, leaving no chance to hear your petty grievances. Clenching my fists, I couldn't help but shout at Bruno. Tell me, Bruno, what right do you have to complain to me? Bruno stood frozen, his lips trembling, trying to speak but failing to say anything. I took a deep breath, ready to leave, but Bruno suddenly grabbed my wrist. Margaret, I was wrong. I'm a bastard. You can hit me or scold me, but please, don't divorce me. During the car accident, I didn't know you were pregnant. I thought it was just a minor injury. We can have more children in the future. I'll take good care of you. Give me a chance to make it right, please? My response was a slap filled with all my hatred. Bruno, you're a real scumbag. I laughed mockingly, tears streaming down my face. So, even now, you haven't looked at my medical records. If you had, you'd know that I was hemorrhaging badly when you abandoned me. I went into cardiac arrest shortly after getting on the operating table. To save my life, the doctors had to replace almost all my blood and even remove my uterus. And now you hypocritically tell me we can have more children? How am I supposed to have children? With each of my accusatory words, Bruno's expression grew more frantic. By the end, he looked utterly devastated, as pale as a sheet. I scoffed, if you truly feel guilty, remember to sign the divorce papers quickly and give me more money in the settlement. Leaving these words, I couldn't care less about Bruno's reaction. I went upstairs to rest. Chapter 8. But Bruno seemed unwilling to give up. No matter how many times I reminded him, he still refused to sign the divorce papers. He started taking over my daily meals. Every morning, he brought me a bouquet of fresh roses. Wherever I went, he was a shadow I couldn't shake off. After 2 or 3 days of this, I couldn't tolerate it anymore. Bruno, do you think this is meaningful? My expression was cold, my tone filled with annoyance. You're disturbing my life. Are doctors so free these days? Bruno pressed his lips together and gave a bitter smile. I've been suspended from the hospital. Someone wrote an anonymous complaint, accusing Bruno of having inappropriate relationships with patients. Moreover, His favoritism towards Camille at the hospital was exposed, leading to his suspension and investigation. One misstep, and all his years of hard work could be undone. But none of this mattered to me. Facing my calm and unperturbed gaze, Bruno forced a smile. Now, I just want to make it up to you. Sure, I'll give you that chance. Really? Bruno's eyes momentarily lit up with hope. The next second, he fell into despair. Sign the divorce papers. I coldly shattered his illusions. If you won't. After 2 years of separation, I can still file for divorce. I had once been blinded by love, suffering deeply. Now, I was finally clear-headed. No one could stop me from moving forward. Margaret, I know I hurt you deeply before, but I truly realize my mistakes. Can't you give me a chance to make amends? Bruno looked at me helplessly, his eyes full of regret. I stared at him indifferently. Can you give me back my child? Chapter 9. After enduring the abortion, I always thought I was strong enough to get through this ordeal, but every night, in the dead of night, there was always the sound of a child crying echoing in my ears. I woke up from nightmares again and again, drenching my pillow with tears. Rationally, I comforted myself repeatedly. Losing the baby was the best choice. This child came too suddenly. There was no future in my relationship with Bruno. Rashly bringing the baby into a loveless family wouldn't be fair to him. Moreover, this child was lost in an accident. I didn't have to bear the guilt of killing him with my own hands. But the uncontrollable sobbing was real. The countless sleepless nights were real. The many donations I made to temples for longevity lamps weren't fake either. Despite all my self-deception, I still couldn't forgive myself. I felt like an unfit mother, hating myself for losing a life due to my carelessness. Before I could even embrace the sudden joy, I had to taste the pain of separation. I hated myself, and I hated Bruno even more. Countless times, I imagined that if I had been rescued first that day, would the child who was destined to never be mine have safely entered this world? Would he have been a lively, active boy? Or a little girl who looked like me? I don't know, and I'll never have the chance to know. That night, Bruno stood in the living room all night. When I woke up the next morning, I found the floor downstairs littered with cigarette butts, and a divorce agreement with his signature on it. After finalizing the documents, I headed straight to the airport without hesitation, embarking on a future that belonged only to me. Daily training and study kept me incredibly busy. By the time I had settled down completely, half a year had passed. I reconnected with old friends back home and got an unexpected piece of gossip. Margaret, you wouldn't believe how miserable Camille's life is now. After the divorce, to avoid unnecessary trouble, I announced it on social media with the excuse of the feelings have faded. Returning to being friends. There's no need to be too harsh in the adult world. But Camille couldn't resist flaunting and provoking. A busybody dug up the dirt on her and Bruno. Not all friends were as clueless and brainless as their mutual friends. Many were indignant and stood up for me. Suddenly, their reputations were in shambles. And just as Camille was about to give birth, the child's father was finally identified. A wealthy woman came forward, accusing Camille of being a shameless mistress and had people beat her until she miscarried and bled profusely. In her final month of pregnancy, it was touch and go whether she would survive. Even though the doctors saved Camille's life, the baby was gone. She was left with permanent damage, bedridden for life. She didn't even have a chance to seek justice. That wealthy woman was ruthless, using mentally unstable people to attack Camille. A few medical records let them easily escape prison time. As for Bruno, he was caught by the disciplinary committee amidst the chaos and dismissed. No one knows where he's working now. Probably some obscure clinic as an assistant. It's said that his life is even more miserable and humiliating. But none of this matters to me anymore. After hearing the gossip, I stretched and continued to immerse myself in my studies. After that, I heard no more news from homeland.